Hi everybody, Barry Edelstein here, Erna Finci Viterbi, Artistic Director of the Old Globe, and welcome to our second program of Thinking Shakespeare Live, Sonnets. I hope everybody's doing well out there and safe and healthy and sound. I'm coming to you live from world headquarters in exile of the Old Globe, also known as my dining room, and I'm very, very happy to be with you. You know, the Old Globe believes that theater matters, and our commitment is to make it matter to more people. And so in this unusual, upside-down, topsy-turvy time, we're trying to figure out ways to make theater matter and do what it does best, which is create community and help us understand things about what it means to be human, which of course we need right now. So we've taken a lot of our programs and figured out how to deploy them virtually, including Thinking Shakespeare Live, which is a program that I do a couple of times every summer in Balboa Park, and we've adapted it for these digital platforms that are so wonderful and reach right into people's homes. Thinking Shakespeare Live is there because Shakespeare is central to the life of the Old Globe. We're one of the great Shakespeare theaters in America. And in that program, we sort of throw back the curtain and open up the doors and let people take a look and see how Shakespeare gets made in the professional theater with a particular emphasis on his language. And so that's what we're going to do today with Shakespeare's Sonnets. Now, the program started 2 weeks ago with our first go round, and we've done some upgrading of our technology. The video was a little jumpy that last time, but you can check it out at the Old Globe's YouTube channel. And last time around, I did a sort of long introduction to what the sonnets are and what they're all about, and then we looked at Sonnet 29. Tonight, I'm going to go through that introductory material a little bit more quickly and get right into the text of the sonnet that we're going to look at. But hey, check out the last one. You'll learn all sorts of stuff about the sonnets, what they are, why Shakespeare wrote them, how he put them together. All right, so here we go. Thinking Shakespeare Live, the Sonnets. Our story begins 400 years ago in the year 1623. That's when that book was published. That's the first complete works of Shakespeare, known as the First Folio. Folio refers to the size of the pages. You can see it says Mr. William Shakespeare's complete comedies, histories, and tragedies. Mr. William Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies has that famous carving of what Shakespeare looked like. Now that volume has all 36 of Shakespeare's plays, but half of Shakespeare's plays had already been printed during his lifetime. The other half would not have survived without the First Folio. In addition to those 18 plays that had been printed during Shakespeare's lifetime, he had also printed a bunch of poems. Most famously, these two, that's Venus and Adonis on the left and the Rape of Lucrece on the right. Tiny, tiny at the bottom, you can see those are 1593 and 1594, when Shakespeare was all of 29 years old. A couple of years before these were printed, there was, of all things, believe it or not, an outbreak of the plague in London. And wouldn't you know that when the plague breaks out, the authorities shut the theaters down? I mean, can you believe such a thing? It could never happen today. And when the theaters were shut down, Shakespeare got busy writing poetry. Venus and Adonis, the one on the left on your screen, became an incredible success, scandalous success. It's a sort of naughty poem about a hot love affair between a middle-aged woman and a gorgeous young man. And it put Shakespeare on the map. Interestingly, not hugely on the map. You can see his name doesn't even appear on the title page of those poems. But jump 15 years later to the year 1609. This is just 3 years before Shakespeare retired. So by 1609, he'd written all of his masterpieces: Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, the Scottish play, Much Ado About Nothing, The Merchant of Venice, Taming of the Shrew, Romeo and Juliet, all the masterpieces. He was hugely famous. And another book of poetry comes out, Shakespeare's Sonnets. Now you can see how famous he was, because look at how gigantic his name is above the title. That was guaranteed to sell a lot of copies, and it did. So this is 1609, the publication of Shakespeare's Sonnets. Here's what one looks like inside from the period. There's Sonnet 20. Now, what exactly is a sonnet? Well, these poems are extremely important to us for a lot of reasons. First, they really capture the voice of Shakespeare. If you get into the language of the sonnets, you hear that remarkable language from his plays. Smart, dense, funny, ironic, full of literary allusions, extremely complex constructions, but most of all, like an X-ray of the human soul. There's something about Shakespeare's writing in his plays, in these sonnets, that's almost miraculous. The depth of the psychology, the depth of understanding of what makes human beings work. The themes are huge. They're about love and betrayal, sex and romance, jealousy, death, time, and an enormous theme that we're going to see a little bit later this evening about the power of poetry to confer immortality, to defy time, poetry's magic power to survive and endure. There are 154 sonnets in this collection, and a sonnet is a poetic form that came to Shakespeare from the Italian tradition, a guy named Petrarch about 200 years before Shakespeare. And by the time that form got to England, it became called the English sonnet, and then when Shakespeare's volume was published in 1609, it became called the Shakespearean sonnet. Let me quickly tell you how these things are built, what their form is. All of the sonnets, all 154 of them, have 14 lines. Those 14 lines are organized in groups. 3 quatrains, a quatrain is a group of 4, like quattro, and then a couplet, 2 lines, so 3 times 4 is 12, plus 2, 14. All of them have 14 lines. They have a rhyme scheme. The last word in each of these 14 lines rhyme, and they rhyme according to a pattern. So here are the rhymes from the sonnet that we looked at 2 weeks ago, Sonnet 29. Eyes state, cries fate. You can see that the rhymes alternate. Hope possessed, scope least, despising state, a rising gate, brings kings, the couplet rhymes. So the first quatrains rhyme alternately. The first and third lines rhyme, the second and fourth lines rhyme of each quatrain, and then the couplet rhymes. And that scheme is true for all 154 of the sonnets. Actually, I think there are 2 exceptions where they do something different, but that's the classic Shakespearean sonnet. At line 9, which is the beginning of the third quatrain, something special happens. It's called a turn, or borrowing from the Italian, a volta, when the argument that the sonnet is making suddenly swerves. So if I were to say to you, wow, you know, it's a drag to be cooped up in my house for all these weeks, but at least I get a lot of time with my family, whom I love and who are upstairs watching me now. Hi, family. That's a turn. The argument is going one direction, I hate being cooped up for all this time, and then but, and it turns, it makes a volta, I am enjoying all this time with my family. And so in most sonnets, at the beginning of line 9, you'll see but or yet or some other word that makes the argument and the story of the sonnet turn a corner. Finally, the 14 lines are written in iambic pentameter, which is a fancy term for blank verse. That's the backbone of most of Shakespeare's poetic writing. And iamb is 2 syllables. The first is unstressed, the second is stressed, so it goes dee-DUM. That's an iamb, dee-DUM. 5 of them, penta, like the pentagon, go dee-DUM, 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 dee-DUM. And that is iambic pentameter. Dee-DUM, 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 dee-DUM. 10 syllables, alternating stress. So the sonnet we looked at last time was, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. 2 lines of iambic pentameter. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. That's iambic pentameter. Now, we don't say it that way. We speak English. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state. So we trust our own instincts as a speaker of English to tell us which word to stress, but then we check it against iambic pentameter. We trust, but we verify our instincts. Trust, but verify. So that dee-DUM, dee-DUM, dee-DUM is going along, but we don't always use it. Sometimes it makes a word special. So that's the form of a Shakespearean sonnet. 14 lines, 3 quatrains and a couplet, has a rhyme scheme, has a turn at line 9, written in iambic pentameter. Now, there are some mysteries about Shakespeare's sonnets. There's that title page again. You can see at the bottom that it was printed at London by G. Eld, George Eld, he's a printer, for T.T., Thomas Thorpe, he's a publisher, and are to be sold at, oh, I can't even see it, William Astley. William Astley, yes, that's the bookseller. So there was a publisher who brought the script to a printer, and then the printer brought it to a bookseller, and those are their names: T. Thomas Thorpe, George Eld, and William Astley. Okay? Now, we don't know whether Shakespeare intended for these things to be published. We're not sure. The scholars debate this. For 400 years, it was believed that he did not, and that Thomas Thorpe did something a little dirty by bootlegging these things and putting them into publication against Shakespeare's will. But in the past couple of decades, scholars have looked at it a little differently, because Thomas Thorpe had a reputation and he had business interests with all the theater companies in London. It would have been a dumb move for him to make William Shakespeare angry, who was so famous at this point. So maybe Shakespeare did know about it, but there's no consensus. You're welcome to go deep internet on this, and you'll read all the different arguments back and forth. So that's the first mystery. Were they meant to be published? The second has to do with this. This is the dedication page, who dedicates the sonnets to their only begetter. That means their sole parent, their single parent, and it's signed by T. Thomas Thorpe. And there is the dedication to the only begetter of these sonnets, Mr. W.H., all happiness. Who is Mr. W.H.? That has been a mystery for 400 years. Who are these sonnets dedicated to, this mysterious W.H.? There have been a lot of candidates. Some say it's a parlor game. It actually means Will himself. It's a mystery about Shakespeare, who was, of course, the only begetter as the writer of these sonnets. Some say it's a funny sort of trick. It stands for who he, meaning it's a deliberate kind of mystery. Then there are all sorts of names of famous people or people who existed in the period, a guy named William Hart. These are the two primary candidates. On the left is William Herbert. He's the Earl of Pembroke, and later the first folio that I showed you before was dedicated to him. He was a patron of the arts, so maybe he's Mr. W.H., although he would theoretically be Lord W.H., so that throws some people off the trail. The guy on the right is Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, to whom Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece were dedicated, but his initials are H.W., not W.H., again, maybe because he didn't want to be associated with poetry or theater people, and so they reversed his initials to throw people off the trail. Not that that would really matter much. So we don't know who Mr. W.H. is. The only person who knows is this fella here, and I have some breaking news. I can reveal for the very first time the name of this fantastic cat, Mr. Whiskers. So I actually think that, there you go, you heard it here first, that is Mr. W.H. The third mystery about these poems has to do with their content. If you read all 154 in order, they tell a kind of story, and that story has four characters. First is a middle-aged male poet who's a sort of temperamental sort, romantic, falls in love easily, gets jealous easily, and is a magnificent writer with a pretty confident sense of his own ability. The first 126 of the poems are written to a fair youth, a handsome young man who is gorgeous and charismatic and promiscuous and has love affairs and makes our poet jealous and then turns to our poet for advice. They have this close friendship that sometimes seems to be like a mentor and a disciple, sometimes gets romantic, sometimes actually turns into an erotic relationship between this middle-aged man and this young man. At about halfway through the 126 sonnets, another poet shows up who's also writing poems to this handsome young man. We call him the rival poet. And then at sonnet 127, our poet ditches the handsome young man and starts writing poems to a woman who's got dark eyes and dark hair and a dark complexion, and she's become known as the Dark Lady of the sonnets. Now, people have theories about who all these figures are. The interesting thing about it is that you really feel like you're getting to know Shakespeare through his relationship with these four figures. And that's why people read these poems as kind of a little biography of Shakespeare. Now, we know from reading contemporary fiction that people use their own lives all the time and fictionalize them. My own belief is that these aren't four people who are in Shakespeare's life, but they do mix elements of Shakespeare's own life. The one thing I can tell you is that you can read all 36 of Shakespeare's plays and not really get a sense of the man himself. And it's frustrating because you want to know his personality. Who is this guy? You read an Arthur Miller or a Paula Vogel, and you know who that person is, but not with Shakespeare. And yet when you read the sonnets, you feel like you're talking to him. So that's why it has occasioned, the body of sonnets has occasioned this group of theories about who these people are, and the hope that maybe it would reveal something about Shakespeare's own existence. So that is the mysteries of the sonnets, where they meant to be published. Who's Mr. W.H.? Who are the people in the sonnets? And we've talked about the form. And so now let's jump in to our sonnet. We're going to look at Sonnet 18, probably the most famous of all the sonnets and one of the absolutely most celebrated poems in all of English literature. In the context of the 154 sonnets, number 18 is really important because the first 17 are the middle-aged poet telling the young, fair youth to have a child. The idea being that he's so beautiful that the world needs a copy of him so that there's more, and also so that as he grows up, his youthful beauty will be preserved in his child. So 17 sonnets say, have a child, have a child, have a child, have a child, and then we hit this poem, number 18, which launches a whole series about this relationship between this middle-aged poet and this young man all the way through 126. So it's kind of a hinge point, a transition point in the 154 sonnets, but mostly it's breathtaking and beautiful and special. So now we're going to jump into the poem. Now what we do in the rehearsal room is we make sure we understand what the poem's actually talking about. So I'm going to take you through it and give you a paraphrase so that we all understand what the language of the sonnet's actually doing. You'll hear iambic pentameter, you'll hear the rhyme scheme, you'll see the 3 quatrains. Ready? Here we go. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. So it's a poet. It's a poet writing a poem, and the poet is about to write or has just written, my love reminds me of a day in July. I'll say July 15th or August 29th, 2 summer days that are very important to me. You remind me of a day in summer. But he's asking a question, should I do that? And then he answers the question, well, no, because you are more beautiful and more temperate, more even-tempered, right? So the question is, should I compare you to a day in summer? Well, not really, because you're nicer than a day in summer. That temperate's an interesting word. The Elizabethans, Jacobeans by 1609, believed that human beings were composed of 4 elements that corresponded to the 4 natural elements, earth, air, water, and fire, and they were called humors. They were liquids. And each of us had 4 liquids in our bodies: blood, phlegm, yuck, gross, yellow bile, and black bile. And those 4 elements would be mixed together, those humors would be mixed together in our bodies, and whichever combination we had determined our personality. So if we had more phlegm than the other 3, we were phlegmatic and a little sluggish. If we had more yellow bile than the other 3, then we'd be angrier, hotter. If we had more black bile, we'd be prone to depression. And the mix of those 4 humors is called our temper. So our personality is composed of the temper of 4 humors, and that survives in English today. If we lose our temper, it means that something in our personality has gone off. The mix of our personality has gone askew. So to say that you're more temperate means you're more evenly mixed than a day in summer. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Here's another reason why I shouldn't compare you to the summer, because in the summer there's wind, and it shakes up the beautiful baby buds that come out in May. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. Summer's short, especially if you're like Shakespeare, if you're in the English countryside in Warwickshire, summer is short. Right? It just doesn't last very long. It's like you rent a house, but the lease isn't for a year. The lease is only for a short period of time. So there's our first quatrain. You see the rhymes at the end: day, temperate, May, date, right? Alternating. You see it's iambic pentameter. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, right? And the argument is simple. Should I compare you to summer? Well, you're nicer than summer. Summer can be windy and rough, and summer doesn't last very long. Second quatrain. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. The eye of heaven is a metaphor for the sun. Sometimes it's too hot in summer, which you aren't. You're always cool and wonderful. And often is his gold complexion dimmed. Sometimes the sun goes dim. Again, in England in the summertime, clouds come by, whatever, June gloom in the morning. Often is his gold complexion dimmed, right? All my San Diego friends, June gloom is going to hit May gray, and you can say, oh, look, his gold complexion is dimmed, right? Quote Shakespeare every day. It'll make you feel a lot happier. And every fair from fair, sometime declines. So now we've been talking about the summer and how summer days are not so great. But now we go into a more general statement that every beautiful thing sometimes loses its beauty. Every fair from fair sometimes declines. Every beautiful thing from beauty fades sometimes by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. So beauty gets ruined by accident. Something weird happens to you or whatever, your hair changes or what have you, and your beauty changes, or nature's changing course untrimmed. Any sailors out there, when you want to change the course of a boat, you trim its sails. So sometimes nature's course runs ragged and the sails haven't been trimmed and you can't control it. There's also a reference here to undecorated, right? It's untrimmed in the sense of undecorated, the way we trim a tree for Christmas. It's untrimmed. So every beautiful thing eventually loses its beauty by accident or because its course isn't controlled. And here comes line 9, the beginning of the third quatrain, and there's our volta, but thy eternal summer shall not fade. So we've said so far, should I compare you to a day in summer? Well, you're nicer than a day in summer. You're more even than a day in summer. Summer days are not so great. Anyway, beautiful things all fade away, but here's the thing, your beauty won't. Thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Owest there means own, O in Elizabethan English, and own were synonyms. So you're never going to lose possession of that beauty that you own. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. Death is never going to be able to get you, right? Because you're not going to be able to fade that. For those of you who know your Bible, that's a reference to Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's what this is referring to. You are not going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. So here's the key. Your beauty is not going to fade. It's going to be saved by eternal lines, namely this poem, and you're going to grow to time. That's an image from planting, botany. When you graft one plant to another, you make it grow to the plant. So your beauty is going to last forever. It's going to grow to time. Now comes the couplet. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this poem, and this gives life to thee. Simple, beautiful, magnificent poem. Should I compare you to a day in summer? Not really. You're nicer than a day in summer. Anyway, your beauty all beauty fades, but your beauty won't, because this poem is going to preserve it. It's just a magical, magnificent, and beautiful poem. Now, I'm going to give you a chance to do it in a minute. I just want to take you through a few technical features of the language before you get your turn. We always take Shakespeare's verse one line at a time. He wrote iambic pentameter, dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. So it's always good to phrase the language that way, one line at a time, 10 syllables. You just have to take a breath, count to 10, take another breath, count to 10. A great trick when you're picking up a piece of Shakespeare you've never seen is to cover the page with a piece of paper and reveal only one line at a time. Say it, then reveal the next line, say it, reveal the next line, say it. The meaning will automatically come clear because that's how Shakespeare wrote it. Also, at the end of each line, a little question happens. What? What do I mean? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? What do you mean? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. What else? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. What else? And summer's lease hath all too short a date. What else? Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, etc. So if you ask yourself a little question at the end of each line, what next? You will find that the language just flows out and the thoughts come to life. Verbs are really important, and here's a list of the verbs. Shakespeare was a playwright. He wrote action, he wrote intensity, and he was a great maker of verbs. Just listen to the verbs in this poem and you'll hear the whole thing. Shall, compare, art, shake, hath, shines, dimmed, declines, changing, untrimmed, shall fade, lose, ost, shall brag, wanderest, growest, breathe, see, lives, gives. And there's so much vitality and intensity in these verbs. And I know some of these are participial verbs and some of these are gerundial verbs. Doesn't matter. Any word that comes from a verb is useful to us as we try and bring Shakespeare's language to life. Antithesis is a big idea in Shakespeare. It means the opposition of ideas. To be or not to be, that is the question. The quality of mercy is not strained, it droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. Not strained, droppeth. I come not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. You hear antithesis, opposition in Shakespeare all the time. There's a little bit of that in this poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Those are opposites. Rough winds, darling buds are opposites. Shines dimmed are antitheses. Sometimes, often are antithetical. So we like to lift the antithetical ideas out of Shakespeare's language. And then, and this is what I want to spend just a couple more minutes on, the changing height of the language. That means the poetic register of the language. We all think that Shakespeare's language is all highfalutin and big and crazy. Most of it's actually quite simple. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Nothing Shakespearean about that. But there is some special language that makes Shakespeare sometimes sound more complicated than he is. And one is in the first line, shall I compare thee? So we have thee, thou, thy, thine. And if you were to stop somebody, stood 6 feet away from someone and said, hey, what does Shakespeare sound like to you? They would, behind their mask, they would say, thou wilt, thou dost, thou will, because thou sounds poetical to our ears. But in fact, thou is not poetical. It's weirdly the opposite of poetical. We know from other languages that there are 2 forms of the second person pronoun. Spanish has usted and tu. French has vous and tu. German has sie and du. Well, English used to have 2 forms of the second person pronoun, you and thou. Now all we have is you, and thou has fallen out of the language, except in, the Amish country. Wilt thou get in the Surrey, Mary? Right? We hear that in like Amish English, but everywhere else, thou has sort of dropped away. You is the equivalent of usted, vous, and si, the formal, and thou is the informal. And you and thou get different verbs. So you go, but thou goest. You do, thou dost. You will, thou wilt. So that thing that sounds so crazy and antique to our ears is actually just a feature of English that has faded away in the 400 years since Shakespeare's time. But the key thing is that it has to do with familiarity. So if I'm talking to my dad, I would use you. If I'm talking to the king, I would use you. If I'm talking to my child, I would use thou. If I'm talking to my lover, I would use thou. The familiar is thou, the intimate, the close. You is the formal. You, tricky, is also plural, which makes it a little bit of a bigger word. But today in English, we only have you and you. We don't have thou. We only have what used to be the formal case. Now, Shakespeare sometimes switches it up. You can use the wrong one to insult somebody. So if I'm supposed to use you to talk to my boss, but I get angry and I use thou to talk to my boss, it's an insult because I'm using the wrong register of language. If my mother, who's supposed to use thou to me, suddenly goes all formal, Barry, Guinness, Edelstein, what have you done? Then I know I'm in trouble. So you can switch the pronouns to affect someone. And here's a line from Twelfth Night, where Sir Toby is telling Sir Andrew how to enter into a fight. And he says, taunt him with the license of ink. If thou thou'st him some thrice, it shall not go amiss. So you can insult him by saying thou to him 3 times. So that's thou. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shakespeare's readers would not have heard that in a formal way. It's the intimacy of a lover whispering, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Has no poetic formality to it. Monosyllables. The last two lines of this wonderful poem, so long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long lives this and this gives life to thee, are all single syllable words. Shakespeare loves ending big speeches with monosyllables. And some of the most powerful expressions in all of Shakespeare are monosyllables. There's King Lear, the most extraordinary expression of grief ever uttered in the English language. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? He's holding the dead body of his daughter in his arms, and in these wrenching monosyllables, he expresses his pain. No big complicated words, no big allusions, just monosyllables. Here's another one, Hamlet, realizing that he's going to die. All monosyllables. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. So monosyllables in Shakespeare tend to slow us down, and they tend to dig deep into the emotional life of whoever is speaking, and that's what happens at the end of this poem. So long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And you hear those monosyllables deepen the emotional life of the language. Finally, questions. Very, very important in Shakespearean language. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? This is a real question I'm asking because I want to know, is this what I should write? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And it's a real question. Now, if you look up the idea rhetorical question in Google, you can do that after we're done, the example that you're going to find comes from Shakespeare. The famous speech of Shylock, hath not a Jew eyes? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? There's Al Pacino playing Shylock. This is put forward as the classic example of the rhetorical question, a question whose answer is in it, not an actual question, a question that doesn't even need to be asked because it's so obvious, so it's just a matter of rhetoric, right? But in the theater, we don't care about rhetorical questions, and neither does Shakespeare. All questions in Shakespeare are real questions. Shylock knows that the answer to these questions are yes. If you prick us, do we not bleed? Yes. But he's putting these two bigots who are attacking him on the spot and forcing them to answer. So he says, if you prick us, shall we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, shall we not die? Real questions, never rhetorical. And that's true in the first line of our poem. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Real question. Always ask questions in Shakespeare. Index words. So long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. That this points to something. So long lives this book of poetry, this sonnet 18, and this gives life to thee. Index, like your index finger, points at something. Here's a famous example from Hamlet. Polonius says, take this from this if this be otherwise. 3 thises. Well, every actor who plays Polonius points to his head, and then his body, and then the point that he just made about Hamlet's madness. So take this from this if this prove otherwise. You have to point to something on the word this, or the language doesn't make any sense. Take this from this if this prove otherwise means nothing. But take this from this, cut my head off if this prove otherwise. So index words are very, very important. And that leads us to the whole question of poetic height in Shakespeare, which we hear powerfully in the final quatrain and couplet. The beginning is about clouds and sun and buds and sails and trimming, and the language is not terribly heightened. But now we're talking about eternity and death bragging and eternal lines and as long as men can breathe. So at the butt, at the volta in this sonnet, the whole register of the language, the whole sound and texture of the language changes and jumps up, elevates. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. So there's a lot of technical information here. When I teach Shakespeare to actors, I use these sonnets a lot because in 14 short lines, you get lessons about how Shakespeare puts the language of his plays together, the technical features, the emotional features, the way we can squeeze all the juice out of Shakespeare's language. Okay, everybody ready? Because it's your turn now. Now, last time, I asked everybody when it was their turn to do the poem to open up their windows and shout some Shakespeare out to the neighborhood like those Italian folks did on their balconies singing songs, or folks in New York banging on their pots to thank the first responders and the healthcare workers. But tonight, we're going to do something a little different. I want you to think about a person you love. Maybe you have someone with you who you love. And I'm going to give you one line at a time, and you're going to try and make all this work, and you're going to ask a question. How do I describe you? How do I write you down, and what will it mean when I do? And I'm going to preserve you forever. So I'm going to get myself out of here, and we're going to read Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare, a line at a time. Ready? Here we go. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Pretty good. Isn't that beautiful? So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. It certainly gives life to me, and I hope it's given a little bit of life to you this evening. So, hey, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm going to stay on Facebook for a little while and answer your questions. If you have other questions for me, hey, drop me a line at hibarry@theoldglobe.org. Go to theoldglobe.org, check out what our artistic department is doing, what our humanities department is doing, what our amazing arts engagement department is doing. We've got an incredible amount of content online, making theater matter even during this crisis. So thanks for being with me, everybody. And hey, we're doing all this stuff for free. If you're so moved to make a donation to the Globe, hey, we wouldn't say no. But again, what you need to do is think about your Shakespeare. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Thanks. We'll see you soon.